The millionaire's son had never taken a single step, until the day his father witnessed the new black maid doing something no one thought possible. There are rare moments in life when a single act shatters years of silence and fear. Destiny Harris, raised in the unforgiving streets of Brooklyn, believed hard work could lift her family out of poverty. Every morning, she ran, clutching her dreams, refusing to surrender to hardship. Yet fate had other plans. Until that extraordinary moment in the Blake penthouse changed not only a little boy's life, but hers as well. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Because tomorrow, the story gets even bigger. Destiny Harris had always been a fighter, not the kind who threw punches in alleyways or shouted her way through life, but the kind whose spirit clung to hope even when everything tangible seemed to vanish. Born into a cramped apartment in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, she'd grown up surrounded by cracked sidewalks, the hum of passing trains, and the steady weight of a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. Her father, a mechanic with a soft laugh and grease-stained hands, had been the anchor of their little household. Her mother worked nights cleaning offices downtown, returning each dawn with tired eyes and the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to her jacket. And then there was her younger brother, Quincy, wide-eyed and eager, still too young to understand the kind of sacrifices their parents made. In those early years, Destiny built dreams like children built castles out of sand, meticulously, piece by piece, believing that if she worked hard enough, the tide could be kept at bay. She imagined a day when she would cross a graduation stage, collect a diploma, and find a steady job that would let her buy her mother a place with a little balcony, maybe even a small kitchen with enough counter space to roll out pie crusts. She saw herself paying for Quincy's college tuition, watching him stride into a future far brighter than hers had ever been. But life, as she was learning, had a way of rewriting plans without warning. The night it all changed was the kind of night that crept into memory like frost. Winter's wind clawed at the windows, and the city outside seemed locked in a hush. Destiny had been bent over her homework at the kitchen table when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a neighbor, worried, apologetic. Her father had collapsed while closing the auto shop. By the time she and her mother reached the hospital, his warm laugh was gone, replaced by the sterile beeping of machines and the low murmur of doctors. A stroke, they said, sudden and fatal. Everything unraveled after that. Without her father's income, the bills became a tidal wave. Her mother's health began to falter under the strain, the persistent cough worsening with each cold snap. Quincy's school fees, the heating bill, rent, all came knocking at once. Destiny tucked her textbooks into the back of her closet. There was no more time for study. Survival had claimed every waking hour. She took whatever jobs she could find, flipping burgers under fluorescent lights that hummed overhead, wiping down sticky cafe tables as suited patrons chatted over lattes that cost more than her lunch, scrubbing bathrooms in high-rise apartments she could never imagine affording. Each job left its mark, her palms raw from bleach, her shoulders aching from hours spent carrying trays, her eyelids heavy long before midnight. Yet through it all, she did not complain. Every paycheck went toward keeping the lights on, toward her mother's medicine, toward Quincy's bus fare to school. At night, she'd sit by the window of their small apartment, watching the city's lights blink like distant stars. Her dreams, once bright enough to chase away the dark, felt dim now, flickering against the weight of duty and exhaustion. It was on one of those gray afternoons, the sky heavy with the promise of snow, that the knock came. Mrs. Ruth, their elderly neighbor from down the hall, stood there in her wool coat and knitted scarf, cheeks pink from the cold. Destiny had helped her a few times before carrying groceries, shoveling her stoop. "Destiny, sweetheart," Mrs. Ruth began, her voice warm but edged with urgency, "I know of a family on the Upper West Side, very wealthy. They need a live-in housekeeper and nanny. The pay is good, and well, the boy you'd be looking after is special. His mother passed last year, and he hasn't spoken or walked since. If you're in need, I could recommend you." Destiny hesitated. The thought of stepping into the home of the wealthy, of becoming part of a world so unlike her own, felt strange. But her mother's illness weighed heavily on her, and the rent was already late. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She nodded. The next morning, she pulled on her threadbare coat, tucked a sandwich into her tote, and boarded the subway heading north. The train rattled through the underbelly of the city, carrying her past graffiti-streaked walls and into streets lined with glass towers. When she emerged onto the Upper West Side, the contrast hit her like a gust of wind. The sidewalks were broad and immaculate, the trees neatly pruned, the storefronts polished and glowing. She walked toward a towering apartment building with doormen in crisp uniforms, its marble entrance gleaming even in the muted daylight. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of opulence, soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, fresh flowers arranged in tall vases. Destiny's footsteps echoed on the marble as she approached the elevator. She whispered to herself, "For Mom, for Quincy, be strong." When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into a hallway that felt more like the entrance to an art gallery. The penthouse door stood at the far end, carved from dark mahogany and adorned with intricate patterns. She knocked, her palm damp against the tote's strap. The woman who answered introduced herself as Mrs. Lorraine Blake. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed, she exuded both grace and quiet authority. "Come in, Destiny," she said, her voice carrying the kind of assurance that made people obey without question. The foyer was immaculate, paintings hung in perfect symmetry, orchids bloomed in spotless pots, and an antique grand piano sat polished to a mirror shine. Destiny felt small here, like a misplaced brushstroke in a masterpiece. Mrs. Blake led her through the halls, speaking in calm, measured tones. "My son Matthew is particular. He designed this penthouse himself. He values order, structure." The words felt like both an introduction and a warning. In the living room, the air was still, almost too still. No family photos, no toys scattered on the floor. Everything was arranged with deliberate precision, and yet the space felt devoid of warmth. "Matthew has suffered great loss," Mrs. Blake said gently. "I believe one day he'll understand there's more to life than perfection." Destiny was about to reply when she noticed a tall figure standing near the staircase. Matthew Blake. His tailored suit fit like armor, his hair swept neatly back. His gaze was sharp, assessing her as though measuring whether she belonged. He inclined his head in the briefest of acknowledgments. "If my mother chose you, then fine," he said evenly. "Just make sure you don't complicate things." The words were polite on the surface, but carried an edge that made Destiny's stomach tighten. He turned away without another word, disappearing into a study whose door clicked, shut like the closing of a vault. Mrs. Blake guided Destiny to the boy's room. Samuel was small for his age, 4 years old, with fine blonde hair and skin pale as paper. He sat by the window, clutching a worn stuffed bunny, his eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. The room was full of toys, blocks, books, cars, but untouched, arranged like props in a store display. "Since his mother's passing, he hasn't spoken or walked," Mrs. Blake explained softly. "No doctor has been able to reach him." Destiny knelt at a respectful distance, not speaking at first. She took a book from her bag, its cover worn from years of handling, and began to read aloud in a gentle voice. Samuel didn't look at her, didn't react, but she kept going. If she'd learned anything from her own life, it was that some walls took time to crack. From the hallway, Matthew watched, his expression unreadable. What Destiny didn't know yet was that this house was as much a prison for Matthew as it was for Samuel. And in stepping through that door, she'd just taken the first step into a quiet, unspoken battle, one that would test every ounce of her patience, resilience, and courage. Samuel's gaze never shifted from the window, his small frame still as porcelain. Destiny's voice threaded through the quiet like a ribbon, weaving one familiar fairy tale into the next. She didn't expect an answer. She didn't expect a glance. She was planting seeds in ground that had long been left fallow, knowing it might be seasons before anything bloomed. When she finally closed the book, she sat there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the city far below. She could hear the distant murmur of Mrs. Blake speaking to someone down the hall. The house was so silent otherwise, it seemed to hold its breath. Carefully, Destiny rose, leaving the book on the carpet within Samuel's reach. She didn't force it into his hands. She knew enough not to intrude. The first few days in the penthouse felt like learning a language without any guidebook. Everything had its place. Every surface shone. The scent of lemon polish clung to the air like an unspoken rule. At dawn, Destiny moved quietly through the rooms, polishing wood until it gleamed, rearranging cushions so they lined up in perfect symmetry. She swept through the kitchen, aligning plates and cups, mindful not to leave a single water ring on the marble counters. Matthew appeared like a shadow in doorways, his presence announced not by sound but by a sudden drop in temperature. "Wipe that counter again," he said one morning, his voice clipped but calm. "There's a streak." He didn't raise his voice, but the tone carried weight, a silent reminder that mistakes were not allowed here. At first, Destiny thought his attention was purely about maintaining the household's flawless order, but as days passed, she realized it went deeper. He monitored everything she did around Samuel. If she sat too close during story time, he would step in. If she tried to coax the boy into playing with a toy, Matthew's eyes would narrow, and his voice would cut through like a frostbite wind. "Don't complicate things," he would say. "Let the doctors handle it." The doctors, however, were never there. Only their rigid instructions, printed sheets tucked into a folder, dictating Samuel's daily schedule, seemed to hold sway in this house. Still, Destiny persisted. She learned to approach Samuel slowly, leaving small invitations for connection rather than direct engagement. A picture book propped open on the table. A toy car nudged an inch closer to his feet. She sang softly to herself while folding his clothes, letting the notes drift to his corner without expectation. Sometimes she would glance up to see Matthew watching from the doorway, his jaw tight, as if he were fighting the urge to tell her to stop. Other times, Mrs. Blake would step in, her eyes carrying quiet encouragement, as though she understood the kind of patience Destiny was practicing. It was during one quiet afternoon, rain tapping against the glass, that something shifted. Samuel sat with his back to the room, his gaze on the slow race of raindrops down the pane. Destiny, sitting cross-legged on the rug, pulled a small, worn puppet from her tote, a silly-looking green dinosaur with one button eye missing. She had bought it at a thrift store for 50 cents, imagining it might one day coax a smile from the boy. Without moving closer, she made the puppet waddle clumsily across the carpet, muttering in a deep, silly voice, "Hello there, I'm Dino Dan, and I have the worst balance in the world." The puppet stumbled, tripped over an invisible pebble, and fell flat on its face. Destiny let out a dramatic groan. "Oh no, my tail's too heavy, someone help me up." For a moment nothing happened. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. A small puff of air, quick and breathy. She glanced up. Samuel's shoulders were shaking ever so slightly, and his lips were pressed together in a way that could only mean he was stifling a laugh. Destiny's chest tightened, not with sadness, but with something lighter, sharper, hope. She kept going, making Dino Dan roll dramatically toward the stuffed bunny in Samuel's arms. "Please, Mr. Bunny, don't just sit there, help me up." The puppet flopped onto the bunny's lap, arms flailing. This time the laugh was audible, a tiny chuckle that broke the long silence like a crack in ice. She didn't push, she didn't reach for him. She simply let the laugh hang in the air, its small warmth stretching further than any words could. What she didn't see was Matthew, standing just beyond the doorway, frozen. That sound, his son's laugh, hadn't been heard in over a year. It startled him, filled him with a conflicting rush of relief and discomfort. Relief, because something inside Samuel was stirring again. Discomfort, because it hadn't been him who brought it out. It had been the housekeeper he'd barely trusted. That night, the air in the penthouse felt different. Samuel didn't laugh again, but when Destiny entered his room to collect laundry, she noticed the book she'd left on the floor was now on his bed, the spine open, pages splayed. The days continued like this, small shifts, barely noticeable unless one was paying attention. Samuel would glance at her now, just for a second, before turning away. Once, she caught him humming under his breath while she was dusting near his bookshelf. Each change was fragile, like a soap bubble, and she treated them with the same care. Matthew remained a storm cloud at the edges. Some days he seemed almost watchful, as though trying to decode her methods. Other days he was curt and impatient. One morning, Samuel spilled a bit of juice on the carpet. Matthew appeared instantly, his voice sharp. "Samuel, how many times do I have to tell you?" Before he could finish, Samuel's small hands trembled, curling into fists as his shoulders hunched. Destiny felt the urge to step between them, but Matthew's glare rooted her in place. "Step back," he said. She obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her. Later, in the solitude of her small quarters, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her chest aching with the image of Samuel's wide, frightened eyes. She thought of her father, how he'd told her once, "Don't let anyone take away your worth, destiny, not unless you hand it to them." That night, she made herself a promise. She wouldn't give up on Samuel, no matter how many doors Matthew tried to close. Mrs. Blake noticed, of course. She would catch Destiny in the kitchen late at night, brewing tea after a long day, and simply give her a knowing nod. Once, she whispered, "He's not as strong as he looks, dear, and that boy, he needs someone who will stay." Destiny clung to that thought like a lifeline. Her patience was tested daily. There were moments when Samuel would retreat completely, ignoring her for hours. There were days when Matthew's scrutiny felt unbearable, when he'd question why she chose one snack over another, why she let Samuel hold a certain toy for too long. Yet each time, she reminded herself that real change rarely came quickly. Weeks passed before the next breakthrough came. It was early morning, the sun barely rising, painting the penthouse in pale gold. Samuel sat by the window as always, but this time his stuffed bunny was lying beside him on the cushion. He was holding the puppet, Dino Dan, in both hands, turning it slowly, studying its frayed stitching. Destiny didn't speak. She didn't move closer. She simply began tidying the bookshelf nearby, her eyes flicking toward him now and then. After a few minutes, he looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time without immediately looking away. It was only a second, but in that second, something passed between them, something wordless, fragile, but real. Destiny left the room with her chest full of quiet triumph. She knew there would be setbacks, that trust was not something Samuel or Matthew would give easily, but she also knew that a single glance, a single laugh, could be enough to keep hope alive. And so, each day, she kept planting seeds. The next morning began like any other. The penthouse was draped in its usual hush, the air thick with the faint scent of polish and coffee. Destiny rose before dawn, as she always did, and padded quietly down the hall to the kitchen. She could hear the city outside, muted traffic, a siren in the distance, the steady hum of life far removed from the sterile perfection of the Blake home. She set about her chores in silence. The rhythm of wiping countertops, arranging cutlery, and brewing tea had become almost meditative, though it never erased the constant awareness that Matthew could appear at any moment with a new set of corrections. But as the minutes ticked on, she began to notice a subtle difference in the air. There were faint footsteps down the hall, lighter than Matthew's measured stride. She turned, expecting Mrs. Blake, but instead saw Samuel in the doorway, clutching Dino Dan. His eyes were half hidden beneath his messy hair, but they were fixed on her in a way they hadn't been before. "Good morning," Destiny said softly, her voice careful not to startle him. She didn't expect a reply, of course, but Samuel stood there, lingering, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't cross the threshold, yet he didn't retreat either. She poured a small glass of orange juice and placed it on the counter near him. "If you're thirsty," she murmured, then went back to wiping the table as if nothing unusual were happening. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him approach. His little fingers wrapped around the glass, and he took a small sip before padding away again. It was a small exchange, ordinary to anyone else, but to Destiny, it was another brick removed from the wall around him. Later that day, she decided to test the waters further. After completing her chores, she returned to Samuel's room with a new picture book she had borrowed from the local library on her way home earlier in the week. The illustrations were bright and full of movement, each page alive with colors and shapes that seemed to leap off the paper. She settled herself on the floor a good distance from where he sat by the window. "I found a new story," she said, not expecting acknowledgement. She began to read, her tone warm but unforced, letting the words fill the room without pressing for attention. She was halfway through when she realized he had turned his head, just slightly, to glance at the page. Her heart gave a quiet jolt. She didn't stop to celebrate, she simply kept reading, careful not to break the fragile thread of his attention. For the rest of the day, Samuel didn't retreat entirely into himself. He moved about his room a bit more, rearranging his toys, sometimes glancing at her, as if to confirm she was still there. When Matthew came home that evening, the shift didn't go unnoticed. His eyes darted from Samuel to Destiny, suspicion flickering in his expression. "What did you do today?" he asked, the question aimed more like an accusation than simple curiosity. "Just the usual," Destiny replied evenly, unwilling to offer more than necessary. She wasn't lying. Reading to Samuel had, after all, become part of her quiet routine. But she could see in Matthew's gaze that any progress she made with the boy was something he both wanted and feared. That night, after Samuel had been put to bed, Destiny lingered in the kitchen, sipping tea and staring at the city lights. Mrs. Blake joined her, moving slowly into the chair across the table. "You're reaching him," Mrs. Blake said, her voice low, as if she were sharing a secret. Destiny shook her head. "I don't know, it's just small things." "Small things can become big things," Mrs. Blake replied, her eyes softened. "Don't let my son's coldness stop you. He means well, but his fear—" She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "His fear builds walls thicker than any stone." Destiny didn't reply, but those words settled in her chest like a promise. The days continued to weave themselves into a delicate balance of chores, careful interaction, and moments so small they might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't been watching for them. Samuel began to sit a little closer when she read aloud. Sometimes he would glance at Dino Dan as if waiting for the puppet to join the conversation. Once, while she was humming a tune her mother used to sing, he tapped his fingers against his knee in quiet rhythm. Still, there were setbacks. One afternoon, while she was helping Samuel pick up a stack of blocks he had knocked over, Matthew entered the room unexpectedly. His eyes narrowed at the sight of them sitting close on the floor. "He doesn't need to be crowded," Matthew said sharply, his voice carrying a chill that made Samuel stiffen. Destiny stood, her pulse quickening. "We were just—" "I said give him space," Matthew cut in, his tone final. The boy's gaze dropped to the floor, his small shoulders curling inward. Destiny wanted to argue, to tell Matthew that his son needed closeness, not distance, but she knew the battle would be lost before it began. Later, alone in her room, she clenched her fists against the frustration building in her chest. She thought again of her father's voice, of the quiet strength he had always encouraged. She reminded herself that persistence was her greatest weapon, that no matter how many times Matthew tried to close a door, she would find a way to leave it open a crack. Her opportunity came sooner than she expected. A week later, on a windy afternoon, Samuel wandered into the kitchen while she was slicing apples. She decided to take a risk. Carefully, she used a small knife to carve one slice into the shape of a star, a little trick her mother had once used to coax a smile out of her when she was a child. She placed it on a plate and slid it toward him without a word. Samuel stared at it for a moment, then picked it up between his small fingers. He examined the edges, the points of the star, before taking a tiny bite. For the first time, he looked directly at her and didn't turn away. In that brief exchange, she felt the quiet affirmation that all her patience, all her careful steps, were beginning to matter. Of course, Matthew noticed the plate later and frowned. "No unnecessary changes to his meals," he reminded her curtly. Destiny simply nodded, hiding the knowledge that the star-shaped apple had been a step forward, one she wouldn't forget. As winter deepened, the city outside grew harsher, icy wind scraping through the streets, gray clouds pressing low. Inside the penthouse, the warmth that had begun to flicker between her and Samuel felt all the more precious for its fragility. She guarded it closely, nurturing it in small, unassuming ways. One night, as snow began to fall in thick, silent drifts, Destiny walked past Samuel's room and noticed the soft glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. She peeked in and saw him sitting cross-legged on the rug, Dino Dan in front of him, the picture book she had brought weeks ago open beside it. He wasn't reading aloud, he wasn't making the puppet speak, but he was turning the pages, glancing at the dinosaur now and then, as though silently sharing the story. Destiny didn't enter, she didn't announce herself. She simply stood there for a few moments, letting the sight settle into her memory like a photograph she would keep forever. She went to bed that night with a quiet smile, knowing that in the delicate dance between hope and setback, hope had taken the lead, if only for now. The following morning, the penthouse felt heavier than usual. Snow piled high on the ledges outside, softening the edges of the skyline, and the muffled quiet made the air indoors almost oppressive. Destiny moved through her routine slowly, her thoughts lingering on the sight she'd witnessed the night before, Samuel turning pages in that soft pool of lamplight, Dino Dan propped in front of him as though waiting for his cue. It had been such a small thing, but it had carried the weight of a milestone. When she brought Samuel his breakfast, she noticed something else. The picture book was no longer on the rug. It had been placed carefully on his nightstand, as if it belonged there now. She didn't mention it, didn't even look at it for more than a second, but inside she carried that observation like a spark. As she set his plate down, she murmured, "Good morning," her voice gentle but steady. Samuel glanced at her, just briefly, then shifted his attention to the window. It was the kind of look that might mean nothing to someone else, but to Destiny, it was an acknowledgement. The day passed quietly. She dusted the bookshelves, polished the silverware, and swept the marble floors, each task done with her usual precision. Yet all the while, she kept an ear tuned for any sound from Samuel's room, a shuffle of feet, the creak of the door, any sign that he might choose to wander into her orbit again. It happened in the mid-afternoon. She was in the laundry room folding freshly washed towels when she heard the faint patter of small footsteps. Samuel appeared in the doorway, holding Dino Dan by one limp arm. He didn't speak, of course, but he stepped just far enough into the room that the toes of his socks brushed the tile. "You here to help?" Destiny asked softly, continuing to fold the towel in her hands. She made sure her tone carried no pressure, only quiet invitation. He didn't answer, but he moved closer to the counter where she had stacked a neat pile of folded washcloths. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out and placed Dino Dan on top of the stack. Then he stepped back, watching her as if waiting for her reaction. "That's a good spot for him," she said, and kept folding, her hands moving steadily as though this were the most ordinary interaction in the world. Inside, however, her heart thudded with something between joy and disbelief. Samuel had initiated the exchange in his own small way. By the time Matthew came home that evening, Samuel was back in his room, the puppet once more in his arms. Destiny prepared herself for the usual inspection, Matthew's eyes scanning every surface, his voice quick to point out any perceived flaw, but that night his mood was less severe. He moved through the kitchen without comment, poured himself a glass of water, and disappeared into his study. The reprieve didn't last long. 2 days later, Destiny was reading to Samuel from another library book, a story about a curious fox who wandered into the city when Matthew appeared in the doorway. His gaze flicked from Samuel to the book, then to Destiny. "That's not one of his assigned stories," he said, his voice cool. "It's just something new," she replied evenly, keeping her tone as neutral as possible. He seemed interested. "I prefer you stick to the plan," Matthew said, his eyes locking on hers. Samuel's fingers tightened around Dino Dan. Destiny caught the movement from the corner of her eye, the slight shift in his breathing, the way his body seemed to brace itself for tension. She closed the book without another word, unwilling to let the moment spiral into a confrontation. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the scene in her mind. She hated the way Samuel's shoulders had hunched under the weight of his father's scrutiny. It was a look she knew too well, one she'd worn herself as a child when the world seemed too heavy to stand against. One evening, when she was stirring a pot of soup, she felt a light tug at the hem of her sweater. She turned, startled, to see Samuel holding out a carrot stick toward her. "For me?" she asked gently. He nodded just once. She accepted it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," she said, and bit into it with an exaggerated crunch. "Perfect." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. It was later that night, while she was cleaning up after dinner, that Mrs. Blake appeared in the kitchen. "You're changing this house," she said simply. She reminded herself of Mrs. Blake's words, "Small things can become big things." If she was to keep reaching Samuel, she'd have to learn when to step back and when to push forward. The following week, the city thawed slightly. The snow on the rooftops melted into glistening rivulets that slid down the glass, and a pale winter sun managed to push through the clouds. Destiny decided it was time to try something different. One afternoon, when Samuel was sitting by the window, she placed a small stack of colored paper and a box of crayons on the table nearby. "I'm going to make a paper bird," she said casually, settling into a chair across the room. "You can make something too, if you want." She began folding the paper slowly, her movements deliberate, letting him see each crease take shape. At first, he didn't move, but as the paper bird began to emerge, its wings taking form, its beak pointed just so, he turned his head slightly to watch. By the time she set the finished bird on the table, he was kneeling on his chair, his eyes fixed on the bright green paper creature. She slid another sheet of paper toward him without a word. He didn't take it right away. Instead, he reached for Dino Dan, pressing the puppet's soft head to the paper as though giving silent permission. Then, with slow, careful hands, he pulled the sheet closer to him. He didn't fold it, at least not yet, but he didn't push it away either. That night, as she cleaned up the living room, she found the green bird sitting neatly beside Samuel's bed. The next day, there were 2 paper birds. Matthew noticed the colorful shapes on the table that evening, his brow furrowing. "What's this?" he asked. "Just some crafts," Destiny replied. "I don't want clutter," he said flatly, but he didn't throw them away. Instead, he left them where they were, and Destiny saw the briefest flicker of something in his eyes, something softer, something uncertain. In the days that followed, Samuel's flock of paper birds grew. Some were folded neatly, others were crumpled in odd places, but each one was a piece of progress. He began to place them in different spots around his room, on the windowsill, beside his stuffed bunny, even tucked into the pages of a book. One afternoon, when Destiny entered to bring him a snack, she found him holding Dino Dan in one hand and a paper bird in the other, as if introducing them to each other. She didn't speak, didn't intrude, but the sight stayed with her long after she'd left the room. It was becoming clear to her now, Samuel didn't just need someone to take care of him, he needed someone willing to wait, someone willing to give him space without leaving him alone, someone who could weave moments of connection into the fabric of his guarded world without forcing him to accept them all at once. Matthew still hovered at the edges, his control a constant presence, but Destiny noticed small shifts in him too. He still corrected her sometimes, still insisted on certain routines, but he was no longer as quick to step in when she interacted with Samuel. It was a fragile truce, and Destiny knew it could shatter at any moment, but for now, it was enough to keep going. One evening, as she was tidying the hallway, she heard Samuel's voice. It was so soft she almost thought she imagined it, a faint murmur, no louder than the rustle of paper. She froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, just a few syllables, spoken to Dino Dan in a voice unused to speaking. Destiny didn't step into the room. She didn't want to break the spell. She simply stood there, her eyes stinging, knowing that this was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could see yet. And deep down, she suspected that Matthew, wherever he was in the apartment, had heard it too. The sound of Samuel's voice lingered in Destiny's mind long after the moment had passed. She lay awake that night, staring at the faint glow of the city bleeding through the curtains of her small room, replaying those barely there syllables over and over. They hadn't been words she could clearly make out, maybe just soft nonsense meant for Dino Dan, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Samuel had chosen to break his silence, even if only for his puppet. She wondered if Matthew had heard it. If he had, he didn't mention it. The next morning, he was the same as ever, methodical, quiet, moving through the kitchen like a man ticking off a checklist in his mind. He didn't glance at Samuel during breakfast, didn't acknowledge the small, almost imperceptible change in the boy's posture, but Destiny noticed. Samuel sat up a little straighter. He reached for his toast without waiting for it to be nudged toward him. When the orange juice glass tilted slightly, he caught it before it could spill, his small hand steady. These were tiny things, but in the silent language Destiny had been learning for weeks, they were loud declarations. She decided not to push. Some victories were better left to grow quietly, like seeds sprouting beneath the soil. She kept her routine steady, reading in her usual spot on the rug, folding paper birds at the table, leaving room for Samuel to choose whether to join her. One grey afternoon, the weather shifted suddenly, and a steady rain began to drum against the windows. Samuel had been unusually restless all morning, shifting from one corner of the room to another, touching toys without playing with them, sitting down only to stand again moments later. Destiny could feel his unease like static in the air. She pulled out a new idea, a small wooden puzzle she'd found at the thrift store on her last day off. The pieces were painted in bright primary colors, each shaped like an animal that fit into a carved slot on the board. She placed it on the rug near him, but didn't say anything. For several minutes, he ignored it. Then, slowly, he crouched down and picked up one of the pieces, a blue elephant, and turned it over in his hands. He examined the painted surface, ran his fingers along the edge, and then, almost experimentally, placed it into its slot. Destiny didn't react. She just kept quietly folding laundry on the other side of the room. After a moment, he picked up another piece, and another. By the time the puzzle was complete, the rain had grown heavier, streaking the windows in long, uneven trails. Samuel sat cross-legged, staring at his work as though deciding whether it was finished. Then he picked up Dino Dan and pressed the puppet's nose to the puzzle, as if showing it off. Destiny smiled to herself, her heart tightening with a mix of joy and caution. Progress could vanish as quickly as it came, and she didn't want to scare it away. The next day brought one of those tests she had come to expect. Matthew came home earlier than usual, his expression taut. He set his briefcase down and glanced towards Samuel's room. The boy was at the table, coloring with one of the paper birds propped beside him. Destiny was sitting nearby, helping him sort crayons into a small tin. "What's this?" Matthew asked, his voice even but cool. "Just drawing," Destiny replied. His eyes moved from the paper bird to the crayon tin, then to Samuel, who had frozen mid-movement. He's supposed to be doing his cognitive exercises right now. "He will," Destiny said, careful to keep her tone calm, but he was focused, and I didn't want to interrupt. Matthew didn't reply immediately. His gaze lingered on Samuel for a few seconds longer, then he turned away. "Make sure the schedule is followed," he said over his shoulder before retreating to his study. Destiny exhaled quietly once he was gone. She glanced at Samuel, who was watching the doorway with wary eyes. She picked up Dino Dan and set him gently in the center of the table. "Looks like Dino Dan wants a green crayon," she whispered. Samuel's shoulders eased just slightly. He reached for the green. It was in these fragile recoveries, Destiny thought, that trust was truly built, not in the uninterrupted moments, but in the ones where fear had to be coaxed back into hiding. Over the following week, the rain became a near-constant companion. The city seemed wrapped in grey wool, the streets slick with puddles that reflected traffic lights in fractured colors. Indoors, Destiny began to notice a subtle change in Samuel's rhythms. He started drifting into the kitchen when she was cooking, hovering just inside the doorway. Sometimes he would stand there silently for a minute or two before retreating, but the visits became more frequent. Our eyes holding a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps relief. "He doesn't speak much, but the way he looks at you, it's different." Destiny didn't know how to respond. Compliments weren't something she was used to receiving, and in this house, where her presence often felt scrutinized, they were even rarer. She simply nodded and murmured, "I'm trying." Mrs. Blake gave a small smile. "That's more than most people ever do." The next day brought a surprise. While Destiny was reading in her usual spot, Samuel suddenly reached out and placed Dino Dan in her lap. She froze, glancing up at him, but his gaze was fixed on the puppet as though waiting. "Should we tell a story?" she asked softly. He didn't answer with words, but he nodded again, just the smallest movement, but deliberate. And so she began, making Dino Dan stumble through a tale about getting lost in the city and finding friends who helped him find his way home. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his eyes following the puppet's every move. Halfway through, a sound interrupted them, the quiet creak of the doorway. Matthew stood there, his face unreadable. For a moment, Destiny feared he would shut the moment down, but he didn't speak, he simply watched. When the story ended, Samuel reached for Dino Dan, holding him close, as if reluctant to let go. Matthew stepped back into the hallway without a word. That night, Destiny lay awake again, thinking about the way Matthew had looked at them. It hadn't been his usual guarded stare. There had been something else there, something she couldn't quite name, though it made her wonder if the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack too. She didn't dare hope too much, not yet, but she held onto the possibility, tucking it away alongside the memory of Samuel's voice. Progress, she had learned, was a collection of moments, quiet, unassuming, and fragile, but if you gathered enough of them, they began to look like change. The days following that quiet doorway moment took on a different texture. Destiny couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but it was there, a subtle shift in the air whenever Matthew entered the room. He still carried himself with the same precision, his tone still clipped when giving instructions, but there was less sharpness in his voice when addressing her. Once, when he walked into the living room and saw her arranging the paper birds Samuel had made, he didn't comment on the clutter. Instead, he simply paused, glanced at them, and moved on. Samuel, too, was shifting in ways that could only be noticed by someone who had been watching him as closely as Destiny had for weeks. His eyes sought her out more often, as if quietly checking that she was nearby. When she read aloud, his body no longer angled entirely away. Instead, he sometimes sat facing her, Dino Dan resting against his chest like a trusted companion. One late afternoon, when the winter light was thin and the shadows long, Destiny decided to bring a little more life into the penthouse. On her day off, she had stopped by a small corner florist and bought a pot of tiny yellow primroses. They were cheerful, bright against the grey world outside. She placed them on the windowsill in Samuel's room. When he saw them, he approached slowly, his small hand hovering just above one of the blooms. He didn't touch it, but he stared at it for a long moment before looking at her. She smiled, not saying anything, letting him have the moment. Later, Matthew noticed the primroses during one of his silent inspections. Destiny braced herself for a comment about introducing something unnecessary, but instead, he simply asked, "Where did you get those?" "A flower shop on Lexington," she replied. He didn't say more, but the next morning, a vase of fresh tulips appeared on the dining room table, a burst of color Destiny was certain hadn't been there before. It was a small thing, yet she felt its weight. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly during a rainy Sunday afternoon. Samuel had been watching her from the kitchen doorway as she prepared lunch. She decided to involve him without directly asking. She placed a small bowl of cherry tomatoes on the counter and began slicing them in half. Then she set one uncut tomato beside the cutting board and slid a child-safe plastic knife toward him. "You can help if you want," she said casually. He hesitated, eyes flicking from the tomato to the knife, then back to her. She didn't move closer. After a few seconds, he stepped forward, picked up the knife, and slowly, carefully cut the tomato in two. "Perfect," Destiny said softly, and meant it. He cut another, and another. By the time lunch was ready, half the tomatoes in the salad had been sliced by his small hands. He didn't smile exactly, but his movements had grown more confident, and she caught him glancing at her as though expecting her approval to continue. After they ate, he wandered into the living room where Matthew was reading by the window. Samuel approached his father silently and placed Dino Dan in his lap. Matthew looked down, surprised, and for a moment, his hand hovered awkwardly before he reached out and patted the puppet's head. Destiny saw the way Matthew's posture softened, just slightly, as Samuel returned to his spot by the couch. It was as if that simple act, offering Dino Dan, was Samuel's tentative way of letting his father in. The weather turned harsh again the following week. Wind rattled the windows at night, and the penthouse seemed even quieter than usual. On one particularly stormy evening, the lights flickered, then went out entirely. The sudden darkness startled Samuel, and he let out a sharp, frightened breath. "It's okay," Destiny said quickly, her voice steady in the pitch-black room. She reached for the small flashlight she kept in her tote and switched it on, casting a warm circle of light. Matthew appeared moments later, carrying a candle from the kitchen. Mrs. Blake followed with 2 more, setting them on the coffee table. The 3 of them, Matthew, Samuel, and Destiny, ended up sitting together on the floor, the flicker of candlelight softening every sharp edge in the room. For the first time since she had arrived, Destiny felt the walls of the penthouse dissolve, just a little. There was no schedule to follow, no instructions to obey. Only the 3 of them, huddled in the quiet while the wind howled outside. Samuel eventually leaned against her, his small shoulder pressing into her side. She glanced up at Matthew, expecting the usual flash of disapproval, but instead, he was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and uncertainty. When the lights returned, Samuel didn't immediately move away. In the days after the storm, that closeness lingered. He began bringing Dino Dan into the kitchen when Destiny was cooking, setting the puppet on the counter as if it were part of their conversation. Once, when Matthew entered mid-story time, Samuel didn't retreat as he usually did. Instead, he stayed seated beside her, eyes on the puppet, even as his father stood in the doorway. One evening, when Matthew was unusually quiet during dinner, Mrs. Blake broke the silence. "He's speaking more to the puppet," she said. Matthew's fork paused Medea, "To the puppet." "Yes," Mrs. Blake replied, "it's progress." He didn't answer, but his gaze flickered toward Destiny, lingering a fraction longer than it might have before. That night after Samuel was asleep, Matthew knocked lightly on the door of her small room. She opened it to find him standing there, not in his usual tailored armor, but in a simple sweater, his hair slightly tousled. "I heard him yesterday," he said without preamble. "He was making sounds, talking to it." Destiny nodded. "It's a start." For a moment, Matthew looked as if he might say something more, but instead, he gave a single nod and left. It wasn't much, but like every small step before it, it was enough to keep her going. The next morning, Samuel brought the paper birds from his room and lined them up on the kitchen counter while Destiny made breakfast. When Matthew came in, he stopped, looking at the row of bright little shapes. "Birds," Samuel whispered, the word barely audible. Matthew froze. Destiny turned toward him, waiting. "Yes," Matthew said slowly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Birds." It was the first time Samuel had spoken to his father in over a year. Destiny didn't react outwardly, but inside she knew. This was the kind of change that couldn't be undone. The word birds seemed to hang in the air long after Samuel had said it. Destiny didn't dare move, afraid that any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile moment. Matthew stood as still as she did, his hand resting lightly on the counter, eyes fixed on his son. For a second, it looked as though he might speak again, but instead, he took a step closer to the paper birds, his gaze shifting from their bright colors to Samuel's small, intent face. "You made these?" Matthew asked softly. Samuel's head dipped in the smallest of nods. Matthew reached out, picking up the green bird Destiny had folded weeks ago. He turned it gently between his fingers, as if afraid to crush it, then set it back down in line with the others. "They're good," he said, his voice carrying a tone Destiny had never heard from him, something unsure, almost tentative. Samuel glanced at Destiny as if to check whether he'd done the right thing by answering his father. She smiled at him, a small, steady smile that told him yes, he had. Breakfast that morning felt different. Samuel didn't speak again, but he stayed present, sitting upright, glancing between Destiny and Matthew. The usual invisible wall between father and son seemed just a little thinner. Afterward, while Matthew was in his study, Samuel lingered in the kitchen with her. He picked up Dino Dan from the counter and made the puppet peck at one of the paper birds, his lips twitching with the shadow of a smile. Destiny joined in, making the bird hop away dramatically. No, Dino Dan, birds aren't for eating." A small puff of laughter escaped Samuel, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an accident, it felt intentional. That evening, when Mrs. Blake stopped by the kitchen for tea, Destiny told her quietly about Samuel's new word. The older woman's eyes softened, though she didn't seem entirely surprised. I thought I heard something, she murmured. I didn't want to hope too soon. She took a sip of her tea, then added, my son will struggle to accept that you're the one reaching him, but struggle or not, it's happening, keep going. Destiny held onto those words in the days that followed, especially when Matthew's tension began to surface again. His moments of quiet observation were still there, but so were his flashes of control. One afternoon, he interrupted a story she was telling Samuel to remind her that the boys' lunch was supposed to be served at exactly 12 o'clock, not 12:05. Destiny didn't argue, but inside, she felt the familiar irritation rise. It wasn't about the minutes, it was about the fear he carried, fear that anything outside his control might hurt the boy. Still, she noticed the way he lingered in the doorway after his comment, watching Samuel follow the puppet's movements with unblinking eyes. And maybe, she thought, that was its own kind of progress. A few days later, the first real snowstorm of the season rolled in, turning the city into a quiet, whitewashed version of itself. Destiny decided to make hot chocolate for Samuel, something simple, something warm. She poured the cocoa into a mug and topped it with a small handful of marshmallows, then set it in front of him at the kitchen table. At first, he just stared at it. Then, with slow curiosity, he picked up the mug and took a sip. The marshmallows clung to his lip, and for the briefest moment, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been a real smile. Matthew entered just then, his gaze falling on the scene. Destiny braced herself for a comment about sugar or mess, but instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from Samuel. Hot chocolate, huh? He said. Samuel nodded once, his eyes flicking toward his father. Good, Matthew said, and that was all. But Destiny caught the way Samuel's grip on the mug loosened, just slightly, as though some invisible tension had eased. The next turning point came unexpectedly, during one of the coldest evenings yet. The heat in the building had gone out temporarily, and the penthouse felt drafty despite its polished perfection. Mrs. Blake brought out extra blankets, draping them over the backs of the couches. Destiny wrapped one around Samuel's shoulders while he sat on the rug, Dino Dan in his lap. Matthew entered, looking tired from the day. He paused at the sight of his son bundled in the blanket, then surprised Destiny by taking a seat on the floor beside him. Cold? He asked. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. Matthew shifted the blanket to cover both of them, his arms settling lightly against Samuel's back. The boy didn't pull away. Destiny watched from the armchair, her chest tightening. It wasn't a grand gesture, not something that would be written about in a book, but it was something, a warmth in the space between them that hadn't been there before. Over the next week, Samuel began seeking his father out more often, though always in small ways. He'd leave one of the paper birds on Matthew's desk. He'd place Dino Dan in his father's chair at the table. Once, he even tugged lightly at Matthew's sleeve while passing in the hallway. Each time, Matthew's response was brief, but softer than before. One Saturday morning, as light streamed in through the tall windows, Samuel surprised both of them. He approached Matthew in the living room, holding a small stack of folded paper. Without speaking, he handed the stack over. Matthew unfolded it carefully. Inside was a drawing, 2 stick figures, and a smaller one between them. The taller one had brown hair, the smaller one blonde, and the third, drawn with dark hair and a wide skirt, was unmistakably Destiny. Matthew looked at the picture for a long moment. You drew this? He asked quietly. Samuel nodded. Destiny stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or stay back. She saw the way Matthew's jaw worked, as though he were holding back words. Finally, he said, "It's good." He set the drawing gently on the coffee table, his hand lingering on it for a moment longer than necessary. That night, as she was leaving the kitchen, Matthew caught up to her in the hallway. "You've done more than I thought possible," he said abruptly. She didn't know what to say. "He's doing it," she replied. "I'm just here." Matthew nodded, then added in a lower voice, "That's exactly what he needed, someone to be here." The weight of his words stayed with her long after he'd gone. The changes weren't instant, and they weren't perfect. Samuel still had days where he retreated, where his eyes went distant and unreachable. Matthew still had moments where his fear disguised itself as control, but the gaps between those moments were growing wider. And Destiny could feel it now, the sense that something larger was moving beneath the surface, something that, if given time, might pull all three of them toward the kind of connection they had each been missing in their own way. The drawing Samuel had given his father remained on the coffee table for days. It wasn't tucked away or accidentally misplaced as Destiny had half feared. It stayed in plain view, its simple lines and bold crayon colors standing out against the sleek, expensive furniture. Every time she passed by it, she felt an odd kind of warmth. It was as if Samuel had planted something there, a small flag in the center of the house declaring that this was not only a place of order and control, but a home where he was beginning to belong again. Matthew didn't mention the drawing again, but she noticed how his eyes sometimes strayed to it when he passed through the room. It wasn't the look of a man assessing a mess that needed tidying. It was softer, quieter, and tinged with thought. The change in the atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Samuel seemed more at ease moving through the apartment. He didn't linger in doorways quite as long before stepping into a room. He began to sit at the dining table before meals without needing to be prompted. He even started bringing Dino Dan into the living room when Matthew was present, placing the puppet on the couch beside him like an unspoken invitation. One evening, as the winter sun dipped behind the skyline, Destiny found Samuel in the hallway, crouched over a sheet of paper with a handful of crayons scattered around him. He was drawing again, his small hand moving in careful strokes. She didn't interrupt, but she sat down across from him and began folding another paper bird. After a while, he slid his paper toward her. This one was different from the family drawing. It was of the puppet, Dino Dan, standing next to the little bunny he always held. Between them was a crude sun, its yellow rays stretching far across the page. "It's beautiful," Destiny said softly. Samuel didn't answer, but he pulled the picture back and began coloring the sun's rays a deeper gold. For the first time, he looked completely absorbed in what he was making, as though the paper in front of him was safer than anything else in the world. Later that night, she placed the drawing on the refrigerator door with a small magnet. The next morning, when Matthew came in for coffee, he noticed it. He didn't comment, but she saw the way his hand lingered on the handle of the fridge, his eyes fixed on the image for a beat longer than necessary. A few days later, something happened that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. It was a Saturday, and the air outside was brittle with cold. Destiny had been planning to take Samuel to the rooftop garden area for some fresh air, bundled in coats and scarves, but when she suggested it, Matthew appeared in the hallway. "I'll come too," he said simply. Destiny blinked, surprised. Matthew rarely joined them for anything that wasn't scheduled or necessary, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him and Samuel outside together. They rode the elevator up in silence, the muffled hum of the machinery filling the space. When they stepped onto the rooftop, the wind cut across their cheeks, carrying with it the faint smell of snow. The city stretched around them, a frozen expanse of steel and glass. Samuel clung to her gloved hand at first, but when Matthew pointed toward a small patch of snow gathered near the railing, the boy let go. Slowly, he approached the drift, crouched down and scooped up a handful. He didn't throw it, just held it, feeling its cold weight. "Careful, it's cold," Matthew said, his voice low but not stern. Samuel looked up at him for a moment, then let the snow fall from his fingers. He reached for another handful, this time glancing toward Destiny as if to say, "See, I'm fine." For the next 15 minutes, they stayed there, watching Samuel explore the rooftop. Matthew didn't hover or direct. He simply stayed close, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes tracking his son's every move. When they finally went back downstairs, Destiny noticed something unexpected. Samuel was walking between them, and when they stepped through the penthouse door, his hand brushed briefly against Matthew's. The days that followed carried a new kind of rhythm. Samuel's voice, though still rare, began to emerge more often in whispers or single words. He said cup when he wanted his drink, book when he wanted her to read, and once, almost shyly, bird when adding a new folded creation to the growing collection in his room. Matthew's responses were changing too. Instead of giving orders or immediately correcting something, he sometimes asked questions. "What are you drawing? Do you like this book?" They weren't deep conversations, but they were bridges, and each one felt sturdier than the last. One night after Samuel had gone to bed, Matthew stopped by the kitchen where Destiny was wiping the counters. He didn't seem to have come for anything in particular. He just stood there for a moment before saying, "He's not afraid of me the way he was before." Destiny set down the cloth and met his eyes. "Because you're letting him see you, not just your rules." Matthew's jaw tightened as though he wanted to argue, but then he exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. Maybe. From then on, she saw more of those small, unguarded moments between father and son. Matthew handing Samuel a crayon without comment. Samuel placing Dino Dan on Matthew's knee. Both of them sitting at the table while she made breakfast, not talking much, but existing together without the barrier of fear pressing between them. But it wasn't just Samuel who was changing. Matthew began to linger in the common spaces more often instead of locking himself away in his study. Once, she found him flipping through one of Samuel's picture books alone, his brow furrowed in concentration. Another time, he appeared in the doorway while she was telling Samuel a bedtime story and didn't leave until it was over. The real shift came one windy evening in February. The heat had been running high all day, and the apartment felt overly warm. Samuel was curled up on the couch with Dino Dan, half asleep, when Matthew walked in. He paused, then sat down on the other end of the couch. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply resting his arm along the backrest. Then, slowly, Samuel's small body tilted sideways until his head was resting lightly against his father's thigh. Matthew froze, his hand hovering above Samuel's hair. Then, with a breath so quiet Destiny barely heard it, he let his palm settle there, his fingers threading gently through the boy's fine hair. Destiny turned away, pretending to busy herself in the kitchen, but her eyes strung. It was the kind of moment no schedule could create, no rule could force, a moment born only from trust. And in that instant, she knew, whatever walls remained in this house, they were no longer unbreakable. From that evening on, something unspoken had settled between them, something fragile, like the thin layer of ice that forms over a puddle in the night. You could see through it, sense the depth beneath, but one careless step could shatter it. Destiny moved carefully, knowing the closeness between Matthew and Samuel was still new, still testing its own strength. The next morning, she noticed that Samuel seemed more awake than usual. He appeared in the kitchen without Dino Dan, which was rare, and instead carried one of the paper birds in his hands. He set it on the table where Matthew was sipping coffee. Matthew glanced at the bird, then at his son. "This one's new," he said, his voice softer than the clink of his spoon against the mug. Samuel nodded. "What color is it?" Matthew asked. For a moment, Destiny thought Samuel wouldn't answer, but then he said, barely above a whisper, "Blue." It was the first time she had heard him respond to a direct question from his father without prompting. The sound was small but clear, and it seemed to echo in the stillness of the kitchen. Matthew's hand paused halfway to his cup, his eyes lingering on Samuel as if committing the moment to memory. After breakfast, Destiny suggested they take a walk to the park. It was cold, but the sky was clear, and she thought the change in scenery might help keep Samuel's small strides of progress moving forward. To her surprise, Matthew said he'd join them. They walked slowly down the wide, clean sidewalks, Samuel between them. He didn't hold either of their hands, but he stayed close, his steps matching theirs. The park was nearly empty, only a few bundled figures moving along the paths. Samuel's eyes wandered over the bare trees, the icy pond, the pigeons pecking at the ground. When they reached a bench, Matthew sat down and patted the space beside him. Samuel hesitated, then climbed up. Destiny sat on the other side, the winter air pinching her cheeks but warming her in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Matthew pointed to the pond. "Look," he said, "ducks." Samuel leaned forward slightly, his gaze following the birds gliding over the thin layer of ice at the edges. "Cold," he whispered, the word barely carried by the air. Yes, Matthew replied, very cold. They stayed there for nearly half an hour, not speaking much, just watching the ducks and the people passing by. When they finally stood to leave, Samuel reached for Matthew's sleeve, his small fingers curling into the fabric for balance as they stepped back onto the path. The gesture stayed with Destiny all day. It was quiet, understated, but it spoke volumes. That evening, as she read to Samuel in his room, Matthew appeared in the doorway. "May I?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up in surprise, then nodded. Matthew stepped inside and sat on the edge of Samuel's bed. He didn't take over the story, he just listened, his gaze moving between Destiny's face and his son. Samuel shifted closer to her, his head resting lightly against her arm, but his eyes kept darting to his father, as if checking to see if he was still there. When the story ended, Matthew leaned forward. "Good night, Samuel," he said quietly. For a moment, Destiny thought there would be no reply, but then, in the smallest voice, Samuel murmured, "Night." The word hit the room like a spark in dry grass, small, but capable of spreading. Matthew's lips pressed together, and he nodded once before leaving the room. Later, Destiny found him in the kitchen, standing with his back to her, staring out the window at the city lights. She hesitated before speaking. That was big for him. Matthew didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders rise and fall in a slow breath. "I know," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, without its usual edge. "I'm trying not to push." The honesty in his tone caught her off guard. "You're doing better than you think." He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable but not cold. "Because you're here," he said simply, and then he left the kitchen before she could respond. The following days built on that moment like layers of paint on a canvas. Samuel began speaking in 1- or 2-word sentences when he felt comfortable, mostly to Destiny, sometimes to Matthew. He said more juice, red crayon, story again. Each time, the words felt like treasures, precious and rare. One snowy afternoon, Matthew suggested they try baking cookies together. The idea seemed to surprise even him, but Destiny didn't question it. They gathered in the kitchen, Samuel on a stool so he could see the counter, Matthew measuring out flour, Destiny cracking eggs into a bowl. At first, Samuel just watched, but when Destiny handed him a wooden spoon and asked if he wanted to stir, he took it without hesitation. Flour puffed into the air, dusting his sweater, and for the first time since she'd met him, Destiny heard him laugh while looking at his father. Matthew's answering smile was small but genuine, and for a fleeting second, the room felt like what it could be, a family kitchen filled with the simple noise of people who belonged together. After the cookies came out of the oven, Samuel bit into one and declared, "Hot," in a tone that made both adults laugh. Later that night, after Samuel was asleep, Matthew lingered in the hallway outside his room. Destiny stepped out quietly, pulling the door closed behind her. "He's changing," Matthew said, his voice low. "Yes," Destiny replied, "and so are you." He didn't deny it. But with the progress came new stakes. The closer Samuel drew to both of them, the more Destiny feared what might happen if something disrupted this fragile rhythm. Matthew's world had been built on control, and though he was loosening his grip, the thought of him retreating into old patterns kept her cautious. Still, as she watched Samuel sleep that night, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, she allowed herself to believe that they were on the cusp of something lasting. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the real test was still ahead. The snow kept falling for 2 more days, thick and relentless, until the city outside looked as though it had been carved from porcelain. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere felt warmer than it had in months, not because of the heat, but because of the subtle but unmistakable changes between father, son, and the woman who had come into their lives quietly and begun to rearrange the very air they breathed. But as Destiny had sensed, closeness came with risk. The more they connected, the more fragile the balance became. The test began on a Tuesday morning when a knock at the door pulled Destiny from her chores. Standing, there was a tall woman in a navy coat, her hair pinned in a neat twist. She introduced herself as Dr. Elkins, Samuel's pediatric speech therapist. "I had an opening this week and thought I'd stop by," she explained as Destiny led her into the living room. Samuel was at the table, drawing quietly. The moment he saw the unfamiliar face, his body stiffened. He didn't run, but his pencil stopped moving, his eyes darting toward Destiny. "It's all right," Destiny said softly, crouching down beside him. "This is Dr. Elkins. She's here to play some games with you." Samuel's eyes flicked to Matthew, who had just entered the room. Destiny could see the hesitation in his expression too. Matthew wasn't expecting the visit, and unplanned changes were not his strong suit. "Maybe another time," he said quickly. Dr. Elkins smiled politely. "I understand routines are important, but sometimes the best progress comes when we adapt." The words were well-meaning, but they landed like a challenge. Destiny could see Matthew's jaw tighten. "I don't want him overwhelmed," he replied. Destiny stepped in before the tension could thicken. "Why don't we let her stay for a few minutes? We can stop if it's too much." Matthew's gaze met hers, sharp at first, then softening slightly. He gave a reluctant nod. Dr. Elkins sat at the table with Samuel, pulling out a small stack of picture cards. "Let's see what we've got here," she said brightly. She held up the first card, a picture of an apple. "What's this?" Samuel glanced at the card, then at Destiny. His lips parted, but no sound came. "It's okay," Destiny murmured, "just like we do with the books." He looked back at the card and whispered, "Apple." The therapist beamed. "Yes, apple." She moved on to a dog, a ball, a house. Samuel answered each one, his voice barely above a whisper but steady. Matthew was silent the whole time, standing behind them, his arms crossed. But Destiny noticed the way his stance eased as the session went on. After 15 minutes, Dr. Elkins packed away the cards. "You've been doing wonderful work with him," she said to Destiny quietly, while Samuel went to retrieve Dino Dan. "Whoever been encouraging him has given him a real foundation." Destiny felt a flicker of pride, but before she could respond, Matthew stepped forward. "We'll need to discuss scheduling before you come again." When the therapist left, the apartment felt different, charged, as if the visit had stirred up sediment from the bottom of a still pond. Matthew turned to her. "I don't want strangers dropping in unannounced." "She's here to help," Destiny replied evenly. "I know," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, "but I don't want him pushed too fast." Destiny hesitated, then asked, "Or is it that you don't want to lose the control you have?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, she thought he might shut down completely, but then, to her surprise, he said, "Maybe both." It was the first time he had admitted anything like that. The next day, Matthew didn't leave for work right away. Instead, he joined them in the kitchen for breakfast, helping Samuel spread jam on toast. It was a little messy, jam smeared across the plate, the knife clinking against the table, but Matthew didn't correct him. Destiny watched quietly, feeling as though they were on the edge of something important. That afternoon, she suggested they go to the park again. Matthew hesitated, but when Samuel picked up his coat without prompting, he agreed. The three of them walked together through the snow, the boy holding Dino Dan in one hand and Matthew's gloved hand in the other. Halfway down the path, Samuel stopped. His gaze was fixed on a small group of children building a snowman near the swings. Destiny saw the longing in his face, but also the uncertainty. "You want to watch?" she asked. He nodded. They stood for a while, the wind nipping at their ears. Then one of the children, a boy about Samuel's age, called out, "Want to help?" Samuel froze, his grip tightening on Matthew's hand. "It's okay," Matthew said quietly. "You can say no." But Samuel didn't say no. He let go of Matthew's hand and took a few tentative steps toward the group. Destiny held her breath as he knelt in the snow beside them. At first, he only watched, but then he reached out and began patting snow into the middle section of the snowman. When he finally looked back at them, his cheeks were flushed, his eyes bright. It was the most alive Destiny had ever seen him. On the way home, Matthew was silent, but his hand stayed lightly on Samuel's shoulder the whole walk back. That night, after Samuel was asleep, Destiny found Matthew standing in the living room, looking at the drawing on the coffee table again. "You were right," he said quietly, "about control. I've been afraid that if I let go, he'd slip away completely, but maybe I've been the one holding him back." Destiny stepped closer. "You're not holding him back anymore." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no wall there, only the raw, unguarded truth of a man trying to learn how to be the father his son needed. It was in that moment she realized the test wasn't just for Samuel, it was for Matthew too, and they were both passing. The week after the snowman felt like a slow sunrise, gradual, gentle, and impossible to ignore. Samuel was talking more, sometimes in short phrases instead of single words. He laughed occasionally, the sound still small but no longer rare. Even Matthew's posture had changed. He no longer stood like a man bracing for something to go wrong. But Destiny knew change was never safe from interruption. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when her phone buzzed on the counter. It was her sister, leaving a voice message about an urgent family matter. Destiny didn't listen to the whole thing, but she caught enough. Her father had been taken to the hospital. She froze with the knife still in her hand. Her family was several states away, and though she hadn't been close to them in years, the news carried weight. She stepped into the hallway, phone in hand, and listened again. She didn't notice Samuel until he appeared silently beside her, Dino Dan clutched tight in his arms. He tilted his head, watching her face. "It's nothing for you to worry about," she said softly, forcing a smile. "Just something I need to think about." He didn't move, didn't blink. Then he reached out and touched her hand, the one holding the phone, before retreating back to his room. Destiny stood there for a moment, feeling the faint imprint of his touch. She wanted to go after him, to reassure him, but Matthew's voice from the living room broke the moment. "Everything all right?" She turned to see him watching her, brows slightly furrowed. "Family stuff," she said, "nothing urgent." He studied her for a second longer than necessary, but didn't press. "Dinner smells good," was all he said before turning away. The next day, the tension returned. Dr. Elkins called to confirm a regular therapy slot for Samuel, and Matthew answered instead of Destiny. She overheard enough of the conversation to know it didn't go well. His tone was polite but firm, insisting on limiting the sessions to once a month instead of weekly. When he hung up, she asked, "Why only once a month? He's ready for more." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Because I don't want him overwhelmed." "Or because you're afraid you won't be the one getting him," she countered. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to defense. "I'm his father, that's my job." Destiny held his gaze, and part of that job is letting him learn from more than just you or me. He didn't respond, but the set of his shoulders told her the conversation wasn't over. That night Samuel was quieter than usual. He still joined them for dinner, still let Destiny read him a bedtime story, but his focus seemed elsewhere. When she left his room, she found Matthew standing in the hallway, looking troubled. "Something bothering him," Matthew said. "Yes," she replied. "He can feel when we're at odds. He doesn't need to hear the words, he feels it." The next morning, the real blow came. Destiny received another call from her sister. Her father's condition had worsened, and the doctors recommended she come if she wanted to see him. The pull in her chest was sharp and immediate. She went to Matthew's study, knocking softly before stepping in. "I need to go home for a few days," she said. "Family emergency." His reaction was instant, a shadow passing over his face. "Now?" "Yes, I'll be back as soon as I can." He stood, packing behind his desk. "You've seen how much progress he's made. If you leave now." "If I leave now," she interrupted gently, "it's because I have to, and maybe that progress will show him something else, that people can go and come back." Matthew stopped packing. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles pale. "You don't know that." "I do," she said quietly, "because that's what trust looks like." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he looked away, jaw tight. Do what you need to do. That night, Samuel refused to make eye contact with her. He sat curled in his chair during story time, Dino Dan pressed to his chest. Destiny read anyway, her voice steady even though her own throat felt tight. When she finished, she said, I'll be gone for a few days, but I'll be back, I promise. He didn't answer. The next morning, she left before breakfast. Mrs. Blake would be there in her place, but Destiny still felt the heaviness of the absence she was creating. The trip was short, 2 days at the hospital, hours spent in quiet with her father, brief conversations with her sister. By the time she returned, the city felt both familiar and slightly foreign, as though she'd stepped out of its rhythm and was trying to match it again. When she entered the penthouse, Matthew was in the living room, and Samuel was nowhere in sight. He's in his room, Matthew said, his tone unreadable, quieter than usual. Destiny went straight there. She found Samuel sitting by the window, the green paper bird she'd made weeks ago resting in his lap. He didn't look up when she entered. I told you I'd come back, she said softly, stepping closer. After a pause, he whispered, You did. It was only 2 words, but they felt like a lifeline. She sat beside him, and after a moment, he placed the bird gently in her hand. When she looked at him, his eyes were steady. The trust hadn't broken, it had bent, stretched, but it was still there. In the doorway, Matthew was watching, and for the first time, Destiny thought she saw something like relief in his eyes. The days after Destiny's return unfolded with a kind of quiet caution, as if the household was collectively testing the stability of what had survived her absence. Samuel was still speaking, still making eye contact, but he clung a little closer to Dino Dan, kept his voice softer, as though holding on to something fragile inside himself. Destiny didn't press. She eased back into the rhythms they had built together, morning routines, story time, the small rituals of folding paper birds and lining them along the shelf. It was as though she was telling him, without words, we're back where we were, you're safe again. Matthew seemed to notice the same thing. He didn't hover, but he was present in ways he hadn't been before. He joined them for breakfast every morning, sat in the living room in the evenings, instead of locking himself in his study. It was a subtle but deliberate act of staying visible, and Destiny knew it mattered more than he realized. One afternoon, she decided to take Samuel back to the park. The snow was melting now, leaving behind damp patches of grass and icy puddles that reflected the pale winter sun. This time, Matthew came without needing to be asked. They walked together along the path, Samuel skipping ahead in small bursts before circling back toward them. When they reached the playground, Samuel stopped in front of the swings. For a moment, he just stared at them. Then, slowly, he turned toward Matthew and said, Push me. It was the clearest, most direct request Destiny had ever heard from him. Matthew's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. Of course. He lifted Samuel into the swing, his large hands steady on the boy's shoulders. At first he pushed gently, but as Samuel's laughter began to spill out, light, unguarded, real, he pushed a little higher. The sound carried across the playground, weaving into the crisp air. Destiny stood a few steps back, her chest tightening with something that felt like joy and relief tangled together. This was more than progress. This was Samuel trusting enough to ask, and Matthew being ready to give. They stayed at the park until the light began to fade. On the walk home, Samuel slipped his small hand into Matthew's without hesitation. Matthew didn't look down or comment, he just held it. That night after Samuel was in bed, Matthew lingered in the kitchen while Destiny made tea. For a while they didn't speak. Then he said, When you left, I thought he'd shut down again, but he didn't, not completely. Because he's starting to believe people can come back, Destiny replied. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. I think I'm starting to believe it too. In the days that followed, Samuel's confidence grew. He began speaking more during meals, pointing out things he liked or didn't like. He even began telling small stories through Dino Dan, acting out adventures that mirrored moments from his own life. Matthew listened every time, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just letting the boy's imagination run without interruption. Then came the day Destiny didn't expect but would never forget. It was a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight spilling across the floor. She was in the kitchen when she heard Samuel's voice, clear, direct, and without the puppet. "Daddy, look." The words froze her in place. She stepped into the living room to see Samuel holding up a new drawing. This one showed three figures again, but this time they were standing in a park, with swings in the background. All three were smiling. Matthew took the paper, looking at it for a long moment before crouching down to meet Samuel's gaze. "It's perfect," he said softly. Samuel's eyes shone. "It's us." Destiny felt the weight of the moment like a physical thing. This was no longer about small steps or whispered words. This was a declaration. Later that afternoon, they returned to the park from the drawing. The swings were wet from melted snow, but that didn't stop Samuel from climbing into one. Matthew pushed again, steady and sure, while Destiny watched from the bench, the cold air biting her cheeks but leaving her heart warm. On the walk home, Samuel reached for both of their hands at once. The three of them walked that way for the rest of the block, the city moving around them in a blur. That evening, Mrs. Blake stopped by. She took one look at Samuel curled up between Destiny and Matthew on the couch and smiled. "I've never seen him like this," she said. "You've done something remarkable here." Destiny shook her head. "We have." When bedtime came, Samuel didn't reach for Dino Dan. Instead, he climbed into bed and waited for both of them to sit beside him. Matthew read the story this time, his voice low and steady, while Destiny smoothed the blanket over Samuel's legs. When the story ended, Samuel whispered "good night" to them both. They both answered at the same time, their voices overlapping in the small, warm room. As Destiny stepped into the hallway, she glanced back to see Matthew still sitting there, watching his son with a look that needed no translation. She knew in that moment that whatever came next, whatever challenges or setbacks, they had built something that could hold. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. And for the boy who had never walked until he saw someone do the unthinkable, for the father who had been locked inside his own fear, for the woman who had walked into a house full of silence and refused to leave it that way. It was enough. If this story moved you, if you felt even a flicker of warmth seeing Samuel's first steps toward trust, I ask you to pause for just a moment. Think about the people in your life who might need to hear it, not because they know Samuel or Destiny or Matthew, but because they understand what it's like to carry silence for too long. Maybe you know a child who's still hiding behind their own Dino Dan, afraid to speak but longing to be heard. Maybe you've seen a parent so afraid of losing control that they can't see they're holding on too tightly. Or maybe you've been the one who walked into someone else's guarded world and tried, day after day, to leave the door a little more open. These moments, small as they might seem, can change lives. A paper bird on a windowsill, a whispered blue across a breakfast table, a hand held in the park. They're not grand gestures, they're threads, and when you weave enough of them together, they make something that can hold the weight of trust. Share this story with someone who believes people can't change. Share it with someone who needs to believe they can. Talk about it at your dinner table, in your classroom, in your group chats. Let it be a reminder that patience isn't passive and love isn't always loud. And if you take one thing from Samuel's journey, let it be this: progress is rarely a leap. It's a series of steps, some so small you might miss them unless you're really paying attention. Be the person who notices, be the one who stays. Because somewhere, right now, there's another Samuel waiting for someone to fold the first paper bird.